Good morning. My name is Mona Yakubian. I'm the Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa here at USIP. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you, both those of you here in the room, as well as our online audience, to today's discussion, which is entitled A Monopoly on the Use of Force in Libya. We will be examining disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR, efforts in Libya. Let me say a quick word about USIP. USIP was founded in 1984 by Congress and works to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict around the world. We do this by engaging directly in conflict zones, including in Libya, and by providing analysis, education, and resources to those working for peace. I'd also like to say a word about our work in Libya. We've been engaged on Libya since 2012, committed to supporting international efforts for advancing peace in Libya. Starting in 2018, our increased field presence has enabled us to engage directly with Libyan actors, from facilitating in-depth dialogues in the Fezzan in southern Libya, which have been instrumental in addressing local needs and fostering grassroots reconciliation, to our extensive collaboration with national institutions, including the Presidential Council. Our efforts have been deeply focused on fostering inclusive reconciliation. Recognizing the crucial role of DDR in advancing peace and security, USIP remains dedicated to furthering progress on DDR efforts in Libya's security sector. Effective DDR is not just a security measure, it's a cornerstone for advancing peace and economic stability, essential for the peace process. As part of our commitment to the U.S. government's efforts in supporting DDR in Libya, we're actively partnering with the State Department's Bureau of Conflict Stabilization Operations. This partnership focuses on supporting Libyan civilian institutions in the development of a national DDR strategy. Today's discussion is one of the many fruits of our partnership and collaboration. Let me briefly introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll speak. First, we're very pleased to welcome Gail Morgado, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Conflict and Stabilization Operation Bureau at the State Department. She leads the Bureau's efforts to anticipate, prevent, and respond to conflict and instability in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. She will be followed by Tim Eaton, a senior research fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. He's the author of the paper launched today on how local forces shape Libya's security sector. His research focuses on the political economy of conflict in the MENA region, with a particular focus on the Libyan conflict. We will also welcome Andrew Cheatham, who will moderate our discussion with Tim, who is our colleague, a senior advisor here at USIP. He is a lawyer and former United Nations official who's implemented programs in highly complex conflict and crises environments in the Middle East and Africa, including in Libya. With that, I'd like to hand the floor over to Das Morgado. Das Morgado, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mona, the United States Institute for Peace, for organizing today's event, and to Tim Eaton for sharing insights from his research with us today. Understanding Libya's armed groups and identifying entry points for future disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration are essential for supporting long-term stability in Libya. The Bipartisan Global Fragility Act of 2019 and the subsequent strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability set forth an innovative long-term approach to addressing conflict, violence, and instability globally. In coordination with the National Security Council, the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operation leads an interagency process in partnership with the State Department's regional bureaus and missions, USAID, DoD, and Treasury to implement the strategy in 4 countries and 1 region. These are Libya, Papua New Guinea, Haiti, Mozambique, and coastal West Africa. Both the Global Fragility Act and the strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability recognize that America's prosperity and national security depend on peaceful, self-reliant, and stable economic and security partners. Libya's inclusion as a GFA priority country demonstrates that we are invested in supporting long-term stability in Libya. The Libya 10-year plan focuses on national reconciliation and an elected government we can partner with that ensures human rights, delivers services, promotes economic growth, and secures its borders. We are pursuing flexible, adaptable approach focused on community-level programs that can be scaled up as opportunities arise to support national elections, access to security, justice, accountability, establishing pathways to reconciliation, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Regarding this last point on DDR, we are particularly excited to learn more from Tim Eaton about the opportunities and the potential community-level entry points for future DDR. And he's identified through his research. Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to today's discussion. Without further ado, to our speakers. Tim, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Mona and Das Morgado for the kind introduction, and for USIP for kindly hosting me here today. I'm delighted to present some of the findings of Chatham House research, which has been running over the last 2 years, looking at the development of armed actors in Misrata, Zawiya and Zintan since 2011. And I've got some slides, not too many, but I want to take you through kind of some of the top level findings and why we're looking at these issue sets, and then hopefully that will open the door for what that might mean for issues related to DDR. So, in terms of the project, why have we worked on this? Well, Chatham House has been working for quite some time to try and understand how armed factions have developed in Libya. There's been a heavy interest, particularly in the forces of Haftar, the LAF. We've written about that in the past. There's also been a lot of discussion, of course, about what happens in the capital, Tripoli. But I had a sense that, for the most part, these discussions focused either on Tripoli or Benghazi, and there are a lot of other areas of Libya and its vast security sector which weren't really being covered. And it was our conviction that actually there are some quite big differences here. And so we selected Misrata, Zawiya and Zintan, 3 cities that have come to play a major role in Libya's security landscape since 2011 in different ways. And what we've tried to do through a large number of interviews, discussions with officials close to the security sector, outreach and interviews with community members, is understand how those security sectors have evolved since 2011. We've mapped over 400 key individuals, institutions, and armed groups across those 3 cities, and we've tried to get a sense of who they really are. Now, there's a lot of debate, of course, about the nature of Libyan armed groups, and often it's become a bit of a policy trope that armed groups are the source of the problem, and that if you could just move the armed groups aside and their vested interests, that perhaps progress in other areas would be much more straightforward. But I think that what you find through this analysis is that things aren't quite so simple. And of course, particularly given the nature of the networks in these cities and their proximity to the populations, actually, I think the key finding is that these security sectors reflect those city dynamics primarily and map onto the state rather than the other way round. So you can see through these images that these are the networks that we've been following, trying to understand how they've evolved, and some key conclusions. The first one, which I've hinted towards, is that actually, whilst you can do endless analysis of the affiliations of certain armed groups, the creation of new groups, new names, many of these groups like to change their names quite regularly or create new forces, often with names that are difficult to remember. But focusing on key social constituencies and commanders rather than those trends, I think shows you the continuity and the real power dynamics that lie underneath these local security sectors. And that security sector reflects local conditions. And still, whilst this is true to differing degrees, as I'll note, they remain based at their core on social networks that aren't completely distinct from the broader local situation. And as a result, the state affiliations that we see have in most cases proven weak and subject to change. If you follow, and we have all of these groups through their various institutional voyages since 2011, you'll find that many of them have obtained state affiliation through all kinds of different state institutions, from the Ministry of Defense and Interior to the Presidency Council, the Libyan Intelligence Service. And ultimately, though, those affiliations don't necessarily reflect exactly what those armed groups do. There's a very stark difference between what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to be connected to the state to how they actually act. And this is part of a broader debate where we might talk about hybridity, where armed groups are affiliated to the state but not subject to its authority. But I think a good framing point here, and what we're trying to get across, is that whilst SSR is supposed to happen by the state subsuming the armed groups under its structures, actually what you've tended to find is that the armed groups have subsumed the state. So it's happening in reverse, and that has pretty major implications when you want to think through issues relating to DDR. So I'll just walk you through some of the overall findings from the three cities. They're each very complex in their own right, and I could talk about them at some length. And of course, if you'll have specific questions about them, be more than happy to talk. My editors at Chatham House tend to get quite frustrated. The 55-pager was the short version, in my view, but there is a lot of detail to cover here. Overall, though, I think starting off with the city of Misrata, which has kind of become seen as a bulwark of the revolution since 2011, it's got some really interesting dynamics which distinguish it and distinguish its local security apparatus. And particularly the relationship to between the community and the groups is very interesting. We find, and some may contest this, but certainly from the testimony of Misratans themselves, that support for the goals of the revolution, certainly rather than formal state authority, remains at the center of the social contract between the community and its armed groups. And that's really important, of course. The majority of Misratans that have fought since 2011 also don't belong to the military and don't necessarily have a sense of hierarchy and command. And in this sense, you've kind of got a duality of the Misratan security sector. When the city is not engaged in a major conflict, the preponderance of its armed men are demobilized, and they are basically remaining in the city. And the state-affiliated elements of the Misratan security apparatus issue orders and they're followed. But when it comes to war and the city mobilizing, then it kind of transforms into a much wider social mobilization that requires everybody's buy-in and is not following the orders of the state or even necessarily just some key commanders. There's a dialogue in that. Misrata's security sector has been the focus of some reform efforts locally, internationally, and in some sense we found that there was a success in installing a military hierarchy and training new recruits. But actually, when you look beneath them, and there's a table in the paper which shows you that many even of the new armed factions have their origins in revolutionary groups. And actually, the influence of those groups remains on those revolutionary origins and those connections, and that's really important to remember. The clear examples of this are brigades 166, 301, the Joint Operations Force and the CTF, each of them having their origins in revolutionary factions. We found that within the city, the Ministry of Interior affiliated forces had really kind of consolidated their authority since 2015 via the Misrata Security Directorate, and that directorate continues to seek support both from that Joint Operations Force and a special support force to act within the city. And this was effectively something that there was consensus on and a lot of support for. Yet, whilst the other elements of the security sector, the more formal elements, of course, a key commander from Misrata, formerly of the Halbus Brigade, is the Chief of the General Staff, and his efforts to expand the armed forces under the formal aegis of the military, of the Central Military Zone, whilst those groups have expanded, still we don't see them as being influential, and we don't see them as able to access resources and funds and act, particularly when it matters. At the same time, this dual face of the security sector remains, and actually some of the most prominent revolutionary factions within Misrata remain completely unconnected formally to the state's institutions. Those key commanders and this social mobilization remains a key part of the story within the city. Moving to Zawiya, quite a different story to tell here. I mean, basically, Zawiya has become increasingly significant in Libya's security landscape and in political negotiations, particularly since 2019. Its strategic position on the outskirts of Tripoli has led rival national factions to seek to obtain support from them and to be able to then utilize that position to wield influence and control over the capital. But actually what you see from the Zawiyan example is quite different to the Misratan one, where the many Misratan groups since 2011 have remained based on core social constituencies and some have partly formalized, others remain subject to a social mobilization, as I mentioned. Really in Zawiya, what you've got is straight out competition, zero-sum battles over key strategic interests, and a lot of it related to the illicit sector. Two main axes of power have emerged in the city based on familial ties and from neighborhood locations, which has also dictated the means through which the Zawiyan security sector has obtained affiliation with the Libyan state. So these groups, most of them didn't play a significant role in 2011 fighting, have utilized their position and control of the illicit sector to expand into what almost seem like kind of conglomerates, and then use that influence to leverage with the state to obtain formal recognition. And of the two factions that we see, two axes as I would call them, we've got the central Zawiya axis of Mahmoud bin Rajab and Mohammed Bahroun being two key commanders, and they bring largely factions together from the Awlad Saka tribe and family-based groupings located in the center of the city, while a second antagonistic axis has been built on the Abu Humaira tribe under the leadership of armed groups headed by the Abu Zariba and Kushlaf families, two sets of three brothers, which control southern Zawiya and the refinery, although this is becoming increasingly under pressure in recent weeks and months. As I noted, those two axes have largely been formed through competition over control of economic interests, mostly in the illicit sector, and those actors have effectively dictated the terms on which they've engaged with the state. The politicians have sought to reward Zawiya's armed groups for their loyalty with resources and legitimacy, particularly in recent years, and this has led to them being increasingly integrated into the state structure. However, there hasn't really been much that's come with this in terms of efforts to professionalize local forces or break their existing chains of command. Those local forces have been able to dictate. One key development was when the Abu Humaira axis was formalized in the stability support apparatus, while the central Zawiya axis has been formalized through the Ministry of Defence's West Coast military zone. These two axes have backed different candidates in the last couple of years, with the SSA basically falling and seeking to support Fatih Bashagha's government, and of course one of the Bouzariba brothers being a Minister of Interior of that government, whilst the opposing axis has supported the incumbent Beba government. And we've seen over the last year, mostly the 6-9 months, that there's been quite a lot of fighting in and around Zawiya as those proxy battles continue to play out following Bashagha's fall. Moving to Zintan, again, you kind of get a slightly different set of dynamics and a very complicated set of dynamics where Zintan kind of played this very outsized role immediately after 2011 in occupying key areas of the capital. But really, since 2014, Zintan's security sector has fractured significantly, and there have been parallel processes of integration with Eastern and Western-based authorities, and it really is quite a jumble trying to follow how these groups have moved through their formal affiliations. But if you do extract from the minutiae of those dynamics, you can see that it's key Zintani commanders that are leading the negotiation between Zintani armed groups and the state. And these I'll talk about shortly. In a way, you can talk about Zintan's armed groups being based on four factions. Some are pro the government's national unity, some have been pro-Libyan Arab armed forces of Haftar, some are pro-Gaddafi, and others even position themselves as neutral. However, there's quite a lot of overlap between them, and as I noted, I think judging these groups based on those affiliations is a very weak, is a limiting way of understanding them. Some groups have taken pro-LAF and pro-Gaddafi positions simultaneously, which you might think is somewhat contradictory, and while others have technically remained part of the GNU, even though they don't recognize it. So I think this kind of speaks to the complexity of Libya's local features. But in terms of the key commanders who have kind of led the charge, really Osama Zwaili is the main name since 2011 who's been omnipresent, but also Imad al-Trabelsi. They've both acted as focal points for the pursuit of Zintani interests through state authorities in the capital. This was particularly notable when Zwaili was Minister of Defense, and of course Trabelsi is currently Minister of Interior of the GNU, which is a way of the GNU keeping the Zintanis enough on side. Zintan's relations with Haftar and the LAF must be seen in the context of the developments in Tripoli, of the outbreak of the 2014 war, as elements of the Zintan Military Council broke off to join the LAF. And in this sense, the narrative of the Zintanis of the 2014 conflict is one of betrayal, that they were stabbed in the back by other groups, notably those from Misrata, whereas the Misrata narrative is that they saved the revolution and prevented counter-revolution by entering. These narratives are super important. Haftar used links with religious and tribal leaders in Zintan to kind of bolster these connections, particularly with the elements of the Zintani armed groups that affiliated themselves with the Eastern authorities. For them, these were the legitimate authorities and they followed that authority. But by 2016, under Zwaili, there had been a reconciliation under the Government of National Accord. However, despite all of these different dynamics and fighting on different sides, particularly in 2019, where you actually have Zintani armed groups fighting on different fronts, on different sides of the conflict, they never came into direct conflict, and that wasn't an accident. That was very heavily, there was a big social effort to ensure that that didn't take place. And just finishing off on the Zintan point, in that sense, though, really there is a slight opportunity at the moment, because after all of these different affiliations and after the ostracization of Zwaili from the GNU, actually the majority of Zintani armed groups are now announcing that they are willing to work together. But basically, it's the Minister of Interior, Trabelsi, who is keeping the GNU connected to dynamics in Zintan. But Zintan, therefore, now presents quite a looming threat for the GNU's forces. So I probably spoke already for too long about those aspects, but you can see that they're complicated and there's much that we can delve into. When looking at the community's perceptions of armed groups, this is something which is quite difficult to obtain. We worked really hard to speak with as many members of the communities as we could, with a good cross-section. But there were some really strong takeaways that despite all of the criticisms of the armed groups, about many exist, there was a near consensus in all of the cities that they needed their own armed forces to protect the city, otherwise they would basically be subject to domination and devastating consequences. And so those armed groups are still seen to play an important, if imperfect, role in protecting their respective cities. And that's something that's kind of been a bit pushed aside by a lot of the international discussions around these groups who are seen as overly self-interested. But there's a real difference. In Misrata, this looks different. The footprint looks different. There's not so much permanent mobilization. Same in Zintan. Those groups are seen as providing a more socially accountable role. Whereas in Zawiya, there's a continual presence of the armed groups, and that was seen as oppressive. In fact, we really struggled to get people from Zawiya to tell us anything about armed factions because there's a real climate of fear. And that's, I think, a real key difference. Similarly, what these cities saw their role as being within Libya was quite different. For the Misratans, they saw themselves as having kind of a national role. But while they could agree on their security sector protecting them, there's a kind of uncertainty about what Misrata should do beyond its borders. In Zintan, I think there's kind of become a conviction after the failings or the disaster of 2014 that they should just focus on themselves and they should focus on protecting their interests, protecting access to Tripoli, and protecting their business interests. Whereas in Zawiya, the armed groups were seen as very limited, having very limited accountability to the community and very much self-interested. I think I can skip through this a little bit. I just want to emphasize one point here, which I think is important for the discussion to come, in that when the armed groups operate within their city bounds, they're seen as being under the city's social umbrella, and that provides, some kind of expectations and limiting role over the behaviors that they exhibit. But once they go outside of the city and once they operate somewhere else, most of the community members were keen to disown those groups. They saw them as then becoming mercenaries or pawns of politicians and part of a broader problem. And I think this speaks to the dilemma in a way that the legitimacy that exists locally, and it's very difficult to transpose that onto any form of national force, which is not seen as being a national force. It's seen as being self-interested and connected to particular backers. In the paper and in the work, we've done quite a lot of explaining why these armed groups operate differently depending on what's available in the area. I mean, clearly within Misrata is a very successful city with a buoyant business sector. There are a larger number of opportunities available there, whereas when we looked at Zawiya in particular, it's difficult to see, if the armed groups don't do the trafficking and the infiltration of state institutions that they currently do, what the alternatives will look like. And in fact, all of these groups have been quite effective in covering their salaries and operating costs through the state and obtaining political patronage. And that can be in state-owned enterprises where cousins of these leaders have now become placed on the board despite having no qualifications, or increasingly, I think, seeking political power directly. That's something which we're going to see more and more. And if there were elections, I think people like Fred Werry have made the point that these groups would seek to run many of their own candidates, which would maybe not therefore bring some of the outcomes that the international community would assume would come with an election. But also there's a key dynamic of monetizing territorial control. For the most part, these groups remain based in the areas where they're from, and they seek to control protection markets, trade routes, and trafficking. That